It's a scary moment, but even in the midst of immediate chaos, it's important to talk about building our future. How do we make real but constructive change? That's the $50,000 question, right? It took me a long time to feel like I was identifying the most important tools, and I'm still learning. So how do we go from angry to action? I am going to walk you through the reading journey that I have taken as I tried to learn how we could take real climate action. It wasn't until I was a freshman in college that I started formally to learn about environmental issues. And just reading the facts back then got me riled up. How are we going to save the planet from climate change? I was reading things like this. It has tons of good facts, lots of scientifically supported information, as well as I learned more about the history of how we got there, like in the discovery of global warming. It got me even more excited about learning about all of this. But the thing was, none of these kind of books and none of my classes all the way through my college years prepared me for how to really make change. But you have to know the facts first, right? Or else how will you know what we're working toward? So let me start by telling you a little bit about Global Warming Primer. One of the best parts is that the whole book is available online, so I can share it with anyone, anytime. Another one of my favorite things is that it takes a lot of the questions that people often raise about climate change and answers them in a direct, straightforward way. So for example, if you're curious about how we can measure carbon dioxide emissions from back before we had a time with people measuring this on a daily basis, or before civilization period, well, guess what? This book has a great answer right in chapter 1. The author gives a great explanation of how ice cores show us the past. It turns out we can drill into the Antarctic ice to get atmospheric samples from 800,000 years ago. That's right, 800,000-year-old air in a natural freezer system. Researchers can pull up an ice core containing air bubbles from times in the past, and so those air bubbles will show us how much carbon dioxide was in there. So it gives these really cool, clear answers to questions that people often have when they raise questions about climate change. So this book, it's a great place to start if you just want to understand the basic facts of climate change. And if that raises questions about how the heck do we know this and who figured this stuff out anyway, which maybe for some of us is the next logical question, then you can check out The Discovery of Global Warming. This is written like a lot of popular histories. It tells the story of climate science from all the way back in the early 19th century. That's when Joseph Fourier wondered about how the Earth was a livable temperature. He did a lot of calculations and found out that the only reason that the Earth was warm enough to support life was because of our atmosphere. It maintains our heat balance. The book traces its way all the way back up to more recent scientists who have worked to continue to develop the science, including those defending climate science against those spreading lies about it, such as scientists funded by fossil fuel interests. I have one or two gripes about the book itself. For example, it doesn't cover Eunice Newton-Foote, who was the first researcher to demonstrate that carbon dioxide could in fact warm the atmosphere. She didn't get much credit for it at the time, and in fact, John Tyndall ended up getting a lot of the credit. As a woman, she wasn't allowed to participate in scientific societies in the same way that men were at the time. That said, there are a lot of interesting stories in the book. I enjoyed this book because I'm interested in history and I'm interested in understanding how we came to understand climate change. This is a great read. I highly recommend for any history buffs out there. But that still leaves open a big question. Okay, we know some facts. We know how we got here, but how do we take action? Well, maybe your next step is finding out what exactly is going on in the world right now. How are people being affected? Who should I maybe be partnering with to help change things and to decrease climate change risks? Well, one of my favorite books that gets into this is Kivalina, a climate change story by Christine Shearer. With Kivalina, she digs deep into the real story of what is happening in one of the Alaskan communities that has been most drastically affected by climate change. The story of how that village is being pounded by the ocean, all because of the loss of winter sea ice, is a striking one. It's a reminder that the Arctic is changing more rapidly than almost anywhere else. And it's a story that makes you frustrated with the absolute lack of support for helping people, especially Indigenous people, to adapt to climate change. But the book has two facets. It's not just the story of Kivalina itself, but also the story of why we have not taken action. Kivalina digs deep into why federal policy has been held up. It shows us how a lucrative legal and public relations system was built up to protect polluting industries. So from asbestos in the early days through lead and tobacco, she lays out all the ways in which a complex of PR companies, legal firms, and greenwashing organizations were grown around protecting these polluters. And then she demonstrates how these same weavers of lies have defended the fossil fuel companies. It's a dense but fascinating read and definitely worthwhile if you want to understand more both about who's being affected right now, and about why we have continued to struggle to create deep and lasting improvements to reduce the impact of climate change. Along the same lines, but covering many more locations, is The Water Will Come by Jeff Goodell. I was introduced to this by a colleague at Stetson University, and I love teaching this one. It has so many fascinating stories. Depressing, but fascinating. Each chapter covers a different place, including places you might expect, like the poor neighborhoods of Miami that are often just barely above sea level. But it also covers some of the sites that you might not have even thought about, like Norfolk, Virginia. We keep massive military forces in Norfolk and the surrounding area, but most of them are also barely above sea level. And the base has been progressively affected by storms and flooding. And it's one of the reasons that the military has been so attentive to climate change and has worked to prevent the worst of its effects. Understanding the day-to-day effects on one of our largest military operations makes quite a fascinating read for those of us who've never gotten to spend much time at some place so closely affected by climate change, or even just at a large military facility. In the book, you also get to meet some of the scientists who are at the forefront of understanding how the planet is being affected, including those studying the rapid melting of glaciers in Greenland, and the engineers who are building a flood barrier to protect, or at least try to protect, Venice from rising seas. The Water Will Come gives you a good sense of the places that will be affected by sea level rise all around the world. Wildfires have been in the news a lot recently, and it's important to remember that sea level rise is also going to be a key impact of climate change. The book also gives you some sense of the directions that people think we should go in order to solve some of these issues. But you might say, I still don't feel like you've told me how to do anything myself about climate change. These are just stories of what's going wrong, right? Well, let me give you one more example that helped me drill down on the problem, and we'll talk about that before we move on. This book isn't directly related to climate change. Instead, it's giving the underlying explanation for how we've gotten where we are with corporations and the ultra-wealthy determining so many of our country's decisions. At the Altar of Wall Street by Scott Gustafson digs deep and heavily into the ways in which we have come to worship Wall Street and money as the center of everything. Gustafson is a pastor and religious scholar. I wouldn't say it's an easy read, but it's fascinating as an explanation for how we've allowed money to come to rule our decisions. That, by extension, results in our inability to prevent climate change as well as we might. So better understanding our society's worship of money is part of understanding how we move toward climate change solutions. Now, on the more solutions-oriented end of the same coin is making other worlds possible. It's also subtitled Performing Diverse Economies. First, a disclaimer for all of you all that this is an edited academic volume, so it's kind of dense. It is a series of essays from people explaining how groups of people around the world are developing economies that do not center on capitalism. Ways of building lives that center care and center hope. As an academic book, it's not necessarily pleasure reading, but it is very enlightening to dip into and out of when you're looking for solutions. For example, this chapter in here talks about people developing the North Quabbin Time Bank and the Montague Farm Cafe. The Time Bank members offer one another services like mowing lawns or childcare without exchanging money at all. They bank their hours and exchange their hours for the services they need. That's pretty typical of time banks, but if you're not familiar with them, this gives a great overview of how we can be there for each other without exchanging cash or working within a money economy. Another example of an anti-capitalist form of economy is a worker cooperative. And the very next chapter talks about an environmentally oriented worker cooperative. They take waste vegetable oil and turn it into a useful energy product. Excitingly, though, they are organized as a worker-owned cooperative formed by ex-felons. So they are addressing a lot of current economic issues at the same time as addressing environmental issues. So this book has lots of solid ideas to help us understand what non-capitalist forms of the economy can look like. These can help us get away from having corporations control our decisions. Okay, so from here, I got some ideas for thinking about economies differently. Those could be some of the solutions in which I engage. What if I just want other people to understand the basic issues? Because I want to focus on education. Well, Cranky Uncle versus climate change is a great way to introduce people to the facts behind some of these big climate change questions. And I mean adults. This isn't targeted at children. This book helps us to respond to the climate deniers out there. There's some very good visual humor, especially if you're a science nerd, like here on page 58. And there's also a lot of really great addressing of the facts through fact versus myth comparisons. There are also some quotes from respected scientists, and also some just really on-point illustrations that get at some of the most frustrating but humorous aspects of working in climate change. Like on page 95, where you have the climate denier telling you in every turn that now is not the time to talk about this. Anyone who's been working in climate change will recognize that mantra. The presentation is great, the humor is much better than I'm conveying, but at any rate, it's a great one for if you want a fun approach to the topic of climate change generally, or some good responses to the climate denier out there that you have in your life. And that's a great way to take action, because if you have climate deniers in your circles, you want to use some good tools with them, and it's also just a fun read and a great one for teaching. Now, one of the most essential elements of really digging into changing our society is thinking about how we change ourselves, because it's so easy to go out there crusading and wanting to change everyone else, but the reality is each one of us is emitting greenhouse gases, and each of us has habits that are causing harm to the planet. I find that the more I address my own blind spots, the more prepared I am to help change the big picture. The Spell of The Sensuous by David Abram was one of my early favorites for this. He gets into how our language is shaped by the natural environment and digs through stories of being in magical places like Bali. Abraham is himself a magician, and he interacts with shamans, magicians, and others around his research sites, including places like the Himalayas, and he comes to realize how deeply interconnected they are with non-human species. He comes to feel more deeply interconnected himself while he's in those environments and with those people, and he examines how language and the ways that we speak or write can affect the ways that we think about the rest of the world, especially what geographers tend to call the more than human species. And he highlights the richness, wonder, and excitement that comes from feeling truly deeply interconnected with the more than human world. It's a beautiful book, all by itself. But it also inspired me to think differently about the places in which we live. Now, if you're interested in learning more along these lines, Dharma Gaia is a book of essays. It has a foreword by the Dalai Lama, and it has essays from folks like Thich Nhat Hanh, Joanna Macy, Gary Snyder, and others that you might recognize if you have followed ecological writing for a while. Dharma Gaia was great for helping me to understand how an ecological ethic has existed for a long time in the world, and it specifically speaks to the Buddhist examples, but it helped me begin to see how other belief systems encompass an ecological way of thinking. It's another good one for dipping in and out of, but definitely has essays that are beautiful to read all the way through. Along the same lines, I would put a book that I bet a lot of you are already familiar with, Braiding Sweetgrass. If you don't know it, I highly recommend it. Written by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and also a biology professor, Braiding Sweetgrass draws from her own tradition stories and weaves it in with conventional scientific understandings of biology in a truly beautiful way. It's meditative, it's enriching, but it's also inspiring for reshaping the way that we think about the world and our relationship with all of the more than human species. It helped me understand the importance of gratitude in a new way. So that's a lot of books about changing the way our own mind thinks about the more than human world. This one, Coming Back to Life, is a great one for starting the move into action. It has both the meditative side built into it and a discussion of how to help shape our own minds. But its main focus is in working with groups of fellow travelers to develop solutions within and between ourselves. There are exercises for building an activist group, exercises centered on understanding more than human species as well as human concerns. At the core of the approach that Macy and Brown advocate is the idea that we need to fully grieve for what we are losing and work through that grief before we take action. The book walks us through a cycle, starting with acknowledging our own grief and moving through it to where we're ready to take action. Most importantly, they emphasize that this is not a one-time change within ourselves, but something we must regularly cycle back through so that we can restore ourselves when we're exhausted from our activist work. So that book really helped me get to a place where I was feeling like I understood better how we could change things in the world. But part of my focus all along has been the concrete. What can we actually do? I know a lot of us want to think about what we can do by ourselves, but it's what we can do with others that will have the most impact. That said, here are a few recommendations for ways that you can start taking action for yourself or with other people. Agriculture and the many books I have read about it were my most direct route into identifying concrete solutions. If you watched my video with 3 climate solutions, you know that agroforestry is one of the key farming solutions for climate change. Well, if you just want to start simple, even if you don't live in Florida, I recommend checking out Create Your Own Florida Food Forest. It's a very simple primer on how to think about what a food forest should look like. What are the basic elements? What are the questions to ask? And what are the levels, literal levels of food you might want to grow? If you want to just recreate your own yard to be a place to grow food, or if you want to recover an empty lot with some neighbors, this can give you some good insight. I would also add Permaculture in a Nutshell by Patrick Whitefield. It gives a good breakdown of the basics of how to grow food in an ecologically friendly way. The two of these are both very thin books, but with a strong set of principles and ideas. With them, we can start to take action to grow food for ourselves and for others in a way that very directly benefits the planet. Growing in permaculture style or food forest style, whichever it is you want to use, it's important to emphasize that these traditions are ultimately inspired by so many different indigenous communities around the world. These are fundamentally indigenous traditions that have been adopted by those who want to improve the planet. These methods are a way to draw more species into your space, to bring birds, to bring fungi, to bring all of the soil to life. So this is a great way to start interacting with the natural world and improving the planet. Now, if you're interested in the food side, but you want to know more about the history or the theory of food forests, an interesting read is The Maya Forest Garden by Annabelle Ford and Ronald Nye. This one gets pretty theoretical in places, but it also has some lay descriptions in parts of the book that are very helpful. Readers can learn what food forests looked like in the past in the Maya region of Mexico and Guatemala, but also how they look now. Because, as it turns out, the Lacandon region of the Maya zone is still growing this way. This is in Chiapas and close by. Before Europeans arrived, much of the Maya zone was grown with the food forest system described in the book, and it persists in the Lacandon region. The food forest is highly complex, supporting thousands of species. It also supports the material needs of the people who live there. It's an incredible system, and it's worth reading just for the inspiration that comes from understanding how a food forest can provide for all of your needs. This particular system may be in the tropical zone, but it helps us to think about the temperate zones that also have similar traditions. I don't have a good book to recommend for indigenous temperate food forest systems, but I've read enough articles about the northeastern United States and what it was like before Europeans arrived to say that a very similar set of systems existed in the Northeast. Only it was not quite such an integrated system as you encounter in the Maya Forest Garden. So the Maya Forest Garden is a great book describing an incredible climate solution. These systems are able to sequester a lot of carbon while also supplying the needs of the people. The systems are far more climate friendly than our existing conventional agriculture systems as well. And just in case you want something that talks about the kind of solutions that are not found in agriculture, like many of you probably do, I have another book to recommend. I love this book for the way it talks about our human systems, and I'm going to recommend it even though it's a very academic one. It's called The Political Economy of Low Carbon Transformation, or Breaking the Habits of Capitalism by Harold Wilhite. What I love about this book is how he really helps you to question the ways that we do things. He talks about the history of starting to use deodorant and why we use deodorant and our own perceptions of it. And he talks about the ways in which we treat our clothes versus the past, and our habits of bathing as compared to the past, and how generally all of our habits that we've developed in capitalism, where we always buy something new, go buy something new, because we're convinced to address a problem that capitalism often has created for us through advertising, like body odor. For example, the way he talks about that really helps you to start thinking about your daily habits and help you to start thinking about how you might be able to arrange your life differently just by changing some of your habits. A great one that you may have heard about before is simply getting a programmable thermostat so that you're not heating your house more than you need to. Automatically, the temperature goes very low during the day when you're not there. This is in the winter. And it goes very low at night when you're warm in bed. And those kind of habit changing things can be amazing for reducing our energy use, and therefore having a great impact on our climate change impact. Okay, there's one more that has been important for me. This Is An Uprising by Mark and Paul Engler gives us direct tools for building activist communities. Moreover, it offers tactics and strategies for overcoming authoritarian leadership. It presents all of this through a historical lens, but even if you're just searching for tools, I recommend skimming and diving to find the best of it in this book. And this is another one I highly recommend as readable and interesting, especially in this moment. So that's the last one I'll tell you about today. In the comments, I would love to hear about some of your favorite climate change books, as well as anything else that this video got you thinking about. See you soon.